All right. Sorry, technical difficulties. I'm going to be emailing like 100 people and after we get started. We're only 5 minutes late. I think that's a win. My stress levels were just 10 for anybody that's in the audience. That was a 10 out of 10. Jay was not panicking, but I could tell on the other end he was about to start, getting angry. All right. We're getting more people in. I'm going to go email the list and see if we can get everybody else. So don't worry about emailing people, Jay. I'll go back and do it and get everybody in here.
All right. Sounds good.
Do you want to pull up your screen?
Yeah. Why don't I take over and then you can go do your thing and I'll give the intro here.
Okay. Cool.
Well, thank you, everyone. Sorry about the late start here, but excited to chat with you today about something that we've been working on. And many of you, actually, give me 1 second here. One more technical difficulty to work through. Let's see. Okay. So apologies for the delay here, but so cover your SaaS. We earlier this year released a course on financial intelligence for SaaS leaders. And so this is under growthcurve.io, which is a project that Jeff and I have been working on over the past few months together, just a continuation of the work that we've been doing in the community for customer success and SaaS companies. So appreciate you all joining us today. My name is Jay Nathan. I'm the chief operating officer at a company called Churn. We're a high volume subscription retention company. And so check us out if you want to learn more about what we do there. And then Jeff is the head of marketing at Hampton, which is I'll probably butcher it, Jeff, but it's a community for founders of early stage startups. Really, really fantastic place for entrepreneurs to build a network and a community. And so hopefully if you have either one of those needs or desires, you'll check us out. But today we wanted to, we're going to talk a little bit about, I'm going to come back to that in just a second. We're going to cover 3 topics today, really about annual recurring revenue. We're going to talk all about it. ARR, what's MRR? What is net new ARR? What does growth rate look like? Gross retention, which many people on this call are probably already familiar with, and net retention, which also you might be familiar with. But we're going to make sure it's clear how these numbers are derived and what they mean to you as a leader and as an operator. And right now, the whole reason we're doing this is because it's never been more important than it is right now. If you're in SaaS, if you're a leader in any role, if you're in product, if you're in customer success, sales, marketing, to understand the financial impact of the work that you do and to make sure that the work that you do every day actually lends itself to accretive value for the company from a business standpoint. So we're trying to help operational, functional leaders who might be experts in all those different functional areas that I named become business leaders as well. So that's what this is all about. And we appreciate y'all being here with us. So we're going to do questions as we go along. So feel free to put them in the chat. If you have questions based on the content that's coming up and that we're walking through, feel free to drop them in. Jeff's going to, as soon as he sends out this email, is going to try to grab some of these questions here for us to go through as we go. And so we want this to be as interactive as it can be. And in that way, it won't be just me droning on the whole time. So I see a few people have already put where they're calling in from. If you're on the call and you haven't done that, we'd love to hear where you're from. So drop it in there. Jeff and I are both coming at you from the Charleston, South Carolina area on the East Coast of the United States. So we'll jump right in. So what is annual and monthly recurring revenue? Part of the reason that a SaaS company is so valuable is that it's a recurring revenue business. There are other kinds of recurring revenue businesses out there that are actually a lot older than SaaS and technology companies. Think about insurance companies. Think about fitness centers. These are all recurring revenue businesses. But the reason that SaaS companies are so much more valuable to investors and to owners is that they have really high gross margins. And gross margins are the amount of the revenue that they get to keep after paying for the service delivery. We've done a deeper dive on that in our last webinar, which is on our YouTube channel, growthcurve.io. You can go find it there. We talk all about that. But just know that SaaS companies, because we're selling digital products, it costs us very little to make an incremental copy of the software because we're actually not making a copy of the software, but we are able to reproduce the results for an additional customer at a very low incremental cost to us. Okay. So SaaS companies, very valuable. Now, over the past couple of years, we've seen valuations come down. It's become harder. Growth is a little bit slower. But again, that's why we're doing all this. So it doesn't change the fact that software companies are still a very, very valuable business. And, I've read statistics all the time about where this market is heading. It's in the hundreds of billions just over the next couple of years. So still very bullish on this space and what we're doing here. Now, annual recurring revenue or monthly recurring revenue is typically how we talk about the run rate of these businesses or how much revenue that they could generate. But it's important to note that recurring revenue, ARR, MRR, is not actually revenue, but it is a predictor of revenue. And it tells us what, at any given point in time, what we think we're going to generate in revenue for the month ahead or even for the year ahead in the terms of ARR. Okay, so it's a run rate metric. ARR specifically, annual recurring revenue, is backed by one of two things typically. One is either an annual contract where the customer is committing in writing legally to subscribe to your product for a year's time, or it's backed by an annual payment. Okay, so very specific types of revenue that we call ARR. A lot of companies have ARR and maybe also have MRR. So what is the difference between MRR and ARR? Well, you could get to an MRR number by taking an ARR number. So say I have $120,000 in ARR. I could divide that by 12 and tell you what the MRR is. It would be 10,000, right? But there's typically more behind ARR than there is MRR. And that's those contracts or those payments that I mentioned up at the top. So MRR is a little bit different. A lot of times companies will either have MRR because they have more of a monthly relationship that renews with their customer versus an annual relationship. But as companies mature, they often have both. If you have a self-serve tier, you might look at that as MRR. And if you have a sales-driven tier, you might look at that as ARR. We'll look at some examples of how that plays out in just a little bit. And let's see, what else? The ARR and the MRR of a business is really impacted by a number of different factors, which we're going to walk through here next. But before we do, it's interesting to take a look at somebody's pricing page. This is a typical SaaS pricing page. You probably have seen hundreds of these in your lifetime. But this is from Calendly, and you can see here how they lay out their pricing plans. And you can see that some of these, it's pretty small, I know, but some of these, like the standard and Teams version that they offer, are quoted on a per seat per month price. But when you get up to enterprise, we see $15K a year, right? Quoted here right on their website. So you can tell that Calendly probably has a split between what they consider monthly recurring revenue, which would be these two pricing plans, or their annual tier. And those two types of revenue have different value to the business because one is going to be a little bit more sturdy and solid than the other. The ARR is typically going to be more durable. One other thing I'll note here is that if you can get customers to flip from monthly to annual, it can be a good thing for your business. What we often do is we give customers a discount. If they're willing to pay ahead for a year, then we would give them a discount for doing that because it's a big value for us to get cash up front. We're not going to go into cash in this discussion, but again, the course that we provide goes deep into that. And then also we talk a little bit about it in the last webinar that we did. All right, so let's see here. Whoops, give me 1 second. There we go. I just lost my screen. All right, so how do ARR and MRR move? This is sort of the focus of what we do every day from a business standpoint in SaaS, right? We're trying to build the annuity of revenue in the business. So we want this revenue stream to be going up and up and up over a course of months, quarters, and years. And so how do we do that? Well, the obvious thing that we're all shooting for is new bookings. We're trying to sell new customers on our product. We have to hit those numbers, right? That is just sort of a fundamental piece of what we do. But there's so much more to it, as you'll see as this presentation goes along. There's a lot of expansion opportunity that we have within our customer base. So you might upgrade a customer, for example, take them from one pricing plan to the next tier of pricing plan, like the ones we just looked at from Calendly. You might upsell them on a new module. You might do a price increase for your customers. We see a lot of that happening right now because there's some opportunities where customers have been, or companies have been, providing outsized value to their customers, where they might want to drive a price increase, and that's going to drive some lift in the revenue that you collect from each of your customers. On the flip side, we also know that there are ways that recurring revenue goes down, right? We could have downgrades. A customer moves from one pricing plan to the lower tier pricing plan. They could drop a module or a service that they're not using anymore. Or, in the most unfortunate sense of churn, we could lose the customer altogether. And so those downgrades and downsells, it sounds negative on the outset, but the good news is that customers are still staying with you even if they do downgrade. So that's them right-sizing their account with you and their spend with you so that they're maximizing the value that they get. Overall, we sort of see that as a net positive thing. So if you can get a customer to downgrade as opposed to a full cancellation, well, they're still in your stable. You still have the opportunity to sell them new products down the line, and they're still paying you. Now, the place where a lot of this can happen is during renewal. We know we can do upsells, we can do downsells, all that can sort of happen at various points across the customer journey, especially the upsell side of things. Most companies build in protection against going down during a renewal cycle. But at renewal, we get a good opportunity to go have these conversations with customers. So things can go up or down at renewal. And that's just a really key inflection point in the relationship, as most people on this call would probably guess. So there's one other concept that I thought I'd point out here. And again, we covered this in more detail in the course that we provide, but you may also hear about contracted ARR or CAR. I was in the first SaaS company that I worked for as an executive. We used this term, and it was called committed ARR. And that's because our customers we didn't start recognizing the revenue. So the ARR technically didn't go live until the customer was live. And we may have forward dated the contract. There's a number of different reasons that this could happen, but typically it's because there's a lag in when they close a deal with us, and then when we take the account live and launch it. So if you hear that, you'll know what it's all about. It's committed ARR. It's probably backed by a contract or a payment, but we're just not recognizing that ARR or that revenue on our P&L yet. Okay. Now, again, I'll remind you, if you got questions, go ahead and throw them out. I know we're hitting some of the basics here to begin with, but throw your questions out. We'll take a pause and we'll answer those as we go along. Okay. And we won't call you by your name if you don't want us to. So one of the things that one of the ways that makes this all very easy to understand, in my opinion, is to have a picture of what the ARR growth and shrinkage and all the puts and takes against ARR look like over a given period of time. And one excellent tool for that is the waterfall chart. This is called the waterfall chart. And you can see here how it's sort of laid out. Also called a bridge chart because it sort of looks like a bridge or a waterfall, whichever way your eyes take you there. But what it tells you, it sort of shows you all the things that happen to your ARR during a period of time. And so, again, ARR and MRR is a snapshot in time kind of metric. So at the beginning of the year, and this is for 2023, we can see here that we had $10 million in our ARR, right? And then we had some downsells, $475K. We had some cancellations. We had some cancellations, $875K. All right. We're going to talk about gross retention here in just a minute. But then we started to have some other things happen. We had upsells. We had cross-sells. We had price increases that we added in to help drive the ARR back up. And then, of course, we had our new bookings. And what you see there is all these things happened during the course of 2023. This is a fictional company, of course. And then at the end of 2023, so as of 12/31/2023, we had $12.3 million in ARR. So this company, if you look at the net ARR growth, grew by about 23% during 2023. $10 million added $2.3 million. So very simple calculation to get there. You can see it's ending ARR minus beginning ARR divided by beginning ARR. That gets you that net growth number. So no matter what happened, that was the growth rate of the entire business for the year. Okay. So, but what if your customers pay on a consumption basis? So one of the questions that often comes up is, well, our customers pay us, by how much they utilize each month. So think about Amazon Web Services or Microsoft Azure. These are consumption-based platforms. These are a few other examples here: DigitalOcean, Dynatrace, HashiCorp, MongoDB, that all have usage-based models. And so how do they calculate ARR? Well, they do have contracts in some cases, but in a lot of other cases, it's self-serve and it's consumption based. And you saw a lot of companies over the past couple of years that had consumption based models have to contract a little bit, or their revenue contracted, because they were downsizing their spend and trying to make sure that they were getting the best value from these products. But how do they calculate ARR? Well, it's actually pretty simple. So DigitalOcean and HashiCorp, for example, they take the amount of money that their customers generated last month and they multiply it by 12. Okay, because they're just looking for a way to say, okay, what's our annualized run rate of the revenue that we are currently generating? So they do it very simply. Dynatrace actually excludes anything that's on a month-to-month basis from their calculations, period. They don't even include overages from their customers. Now, why is that? Probably because MRR and usage overages aren't a big revenue driver for them. They might be part of it, but not big. So it tells me they have a lot of annual contracts that they drive. And then MongoDB, I think, is really interesting because they've got the model where you would have both. You'd have both the annual recurring revenue and MRR, monthly recurring revenue. And annually, they take the last 3 months of the average of the last 3 months of usage, and they multiply that out by 4 to give you an annualized run rate for that. If there's a pattern emerging here, it's that we think of a subscription business in the course of a year, 12-month increments, right? And so we're always thinking about, what does the next 12 months look like? How does that compare to the last 12 months, and so on and so forth. And so MongoDB, on the monthly side, they'll take the last 30 days on those monthly, month-to-month self-serve contracts, and they'll just multiply it out by 12 to get a run rate. So, if you have usage-based revenue, then that these are good examples from publicly traded companies of how they deal with it. This data comes from S1 filings, 10K filings, which is like an annual report that a publicly traded company is required to provide. So if your company is publicly traded, you can go read that report and they'll tell you how they do this. We got any questions, Jeff?
We do. Got a couple.
Cool.
David, and kind of going back to your comments about ARR not being revenue, he said, "Isn't it revenue if a contractual obligation, albeit not yet realized but recognizable?"
Yes. So this is when. So let's say a company signs a contract for $12,000. Okay, what's going to happen to that contract? That means that you're going to get $12,000 in the future. They may pay you cash up front for that as well, but that still doesn't turn into revenue for you until you deliver that service for 12 months. So you get to recognize $1,000 a month in actual revenue. This is GAAP revenue that you get to recognize over the course of 12 months. And then you'll be whole on that contract, right? You'll have captured the revenue for it. You had the cash up front. Great. But the revenue will be earned by the end of the year. Now, what happens to that revenue before it hits the P&L? It goes into a bucket called deferred revenue. Okay, and that's a whole different topic that we could talk about. But deferred revenue is actually a really important metric for SaaS companies as well. And that's just the holding place. It actually sits, I'll get technical here, it sits on the balance sheet as a liability until it's recognized as revenue each month. So we can dig into that more later, but that's how it works.
Cool. I think David said it answered his question.
Sweet.
Justin said, if you have one-time fees, PS, I think he's talking about professional services that are on a multi-year contract, do you look at that as ARR or keep that separate? If it is single year, professional services is still 1x, but what is best practice when on multi-year?
So I think I understand the question. If you have one-time professional services, that's in a different bucket. We're not even talking about that bucket here in this webinar. Okay. So it's completely separate. If it is a recurring service that you provide, then you can treat it as ARR. Now, professional services, I actually ran I had a consulting team in my last company, Jeff and I's last company, that had recurring services contracts, there's a couple of differences there. One is they typically don't have as high retention as your software does, and if they're sold separately. The other thing is they have a lower gross margin because you have people typically behind those contracts that are more expensive than the software is. So those are some of the main differences. But in terms of thinking about it in revenue terms or even ARR, it's not ARR unless it happens under a contract every single year. So hopefully that answers the question, Justin.
Britt just had mentioned, finding the waterfall chart might scare people outside of the C-suite. She's kind of asking others if people have realized that too. I don't know from your experience, Jay, if there's a way that you've presented that to teams that you've led before, if you've tried to walk them through that so they understand. Before, I'll give you a second to think. There was an example for me, Britt. Jay used to have a monthly meeting with our team at Higher Logic when he was running the corporate business. And it was great. He would walk through things like this. It wasn't exactly the waterfall, but what we found, right, is educating the team on these types of things was really advantageous because they got to see why we were making decisions, how we were making decisions, how it impacted the business. We were constantly, our CFO was answering questions in those town halls about revenue. They were trying to explain these things. So I think it's generally, I've found it as a good thing. I know sometimes it can be scary for some of the team when you start to loop them in, hey, we have some churn and oh my gosh, people get scared. But by and large, I think we saw a really positive response from the team.
Yeah, I would just echo exactly what you just said, Jeff. And the it gets more into a cultural thing, right? The more transparent you are and the more clearly you can articulate that you understand what's going on in the business and you're not just waving your hand as an executive and saying, yeah, everything's okay, everything's great. No, because your strategy for a software company is going to flow from that. Like if our gross retention rate is too low, then we know exactly where and why that's happening. Is it downsells? Is it cancellations? Who's canceling? Why are they canceling? Is it our net is not high enough? Like we have opportunity to go sell more to our existing customers. And we know exactly where to go do that. So I tend to opt, especially with leadership teams, for more transparency versus less. But yeah, you do have to be careful and communicate in very simple terms when you communicate to the entire business. But that is certainly an executive team cultural preference that is going to maybe be slightly different for every company.
Okay, I think we got maybe two quick ones. And
cool.
Carlos mentioned companies that pay or companies that have a consumption model. Is that a business model that's typically more related to cloud companies versus a SaaS company?
That's a great question. Yeah, I think it's you're mostly going to find cloud services types of business that do consumption based. Although a lot of SaaS companies have a consumption, if not the whole thing, they have some consumption component of it as well. I guess I think about, I don't know if this is 100% true, but I think about MailChimp and other like email service provider types of platforms where you pay for more if you use more kind of thing.
Yeah. Same thing I was thinking about. HubSpot, I think, has similar. They do have some kind of seat aspects potentially, but they also have contact or consumption bases around how many contacts you capture, how many emails you send, that kind of stuff. Ravi says, in the fictitious example that we had on the waterfall, is it accurate to say that the customer's NRR grew, but their GRR dropped? You're stealing our thunder, Ravi. So yes, you will see us talk about that more. And then last question, I think we can try and move on. Galen says, might a professional services managed services annual contract count as ARR?
Yeah, it certainly can. And it goes back to the example that I gave of the company I worked in where we did have that. Now, the challenge, if you count it as ARR, then you better be sure that it actually is recurring. Because if you put it on your financial reports and highlight it in the board meetings and highlight it in your investor meetings as recurring revenue, and then it's churning at a high rate because it's not as sticky as your product, that's where you tend to run into problems, right? And so we had some challenges with that we had to work through. But generally speaking, anything can be recurring revenue. It's not really this is not a GAAP metric. So GAAP stands for Generally Accepted Accounting Principles. GAAP applies to every business in the world, or at least in the United States. And it doesn't have specific regulations and requirements around SaaS companies. That's why when you sit on an earnings call for Salesforce or HubSpot, you'll hear them talk about GAAP and non-GAAP earnings and GAAP and non-GAAP revenue, because there are different ways of looking at it so that we can really understand the underlying operations and performance of the business.
All right, last one I promise, and then we'll move on. Frankie says, if you use the MongoDB example that you have up here, and they have a reduction over a quarter, would you count the difference as a downsell and MRR and evaluate every quarter?
That is a really good question. I think you would probably not want to. It technically is a downsell or a downgrade, right? Depending on how you look at it. So I think you would do that. You wouldn't necessarily book a downgrade in that. When I think of downgrades, I think of a very specific point in time, like you're at a renewal and I'm going from plan B, which is $100 a month, to plan A, which is $75 a month. And then I'm committing to that for a year. I would book, a $25 reduction in that account. But it is technically a downsell. And I think that's how you would probably talk about it, but it's more of just a fluctuation in usage. So it's not a booked downsell per se, if that makes sense, Frankie. And if that's a Frankie, I think it is. Hey, Frankie. All right, cool. So should we jump forward and then really dig into Robbie's points? Because I think they were spot on. And Jeff, keep me honest as we go through this with what Robbie was asking there, because make sure that we hit it. So the revenue, the ARR waterfall or the bridge chart can be helpful to visualize what's happening from a gross retention and a net retention standpoint, okay, and an overall growth. We looked at overall ARR growth, net ARR growth just a minute ago, which takes into account everything and just where you started and where you ended. But it gets more nuanced, as we know. So what is gross revenue retention? Well, that is the beginning ARR. So the ARR that you had from your current customers at the beginning of the period. For this particular chart, it's the beginning of 2023. Could be any period, right? And then you factor in the downsells and the cancellations. When I was building this chart, I didn't make the math easy on myself, so I had to write it down. But what you could see is between downsells and cancellations, we lost about $1.35 million out of that original $10 million we had at the beginning of the year. Okay. So that means our gross retention rate is, well, we retained 8.65 million of it. So our gross retention rate is 86.5% in this case. So gross retention is it's really focusing in on exactly on that set of customers that we had at the beginning of the period. Gross retention can also only ever be 100%. Okay. So anything this is a good rule of thumb to remember, anything that could push ARR up over where it began at the beginning of the year would go into the net retention calculation, which we're going to look at next. Okay. So 86.5% does not include any expansion from those customers, any price increases from those customers, and certainly doesn't include any new bookings that are coming in. Okay. They'll be calculated in next year's gross retention calculation. Okay. So that's GRR. We throw this term around all the time, but got to make sure you know exactly what it means. By the way, again, a downsell is a much better situation than a full-blown cancellation where we don't have the opportunity to expand with that customer anymore or use them as an advocate, so on and so forth. Okay. From a benchmarking perspective, we are good friends with the folks over at Benchmark. Hey, Ray, if you're listening. But it's important to know that investors in your company and people that might be interested in buying your company, they look at a lot of different companies and they try to understand and benchmark them against one another. And if you go out and look at the Benchmark study from 2023, the median gross retention rate is about 89%. Of course, you can see it tops out at 100% for gross retention. And in the first quartile, the lowest performing businesses are somewhere in the 50 to 80%. Okay, so you want to be, typically what we think about is getting a 9 in front of that gross retention number. If you're an ERP system or a CRM system or an HRIS type platform, some big durable platform, then your gross retention rate may be even higher, maybe 95, 97%, because you're only losing customers when they go out of business or they get bought by a bigger competitor who then puts them on their own technology. So 90 is sort of that magic number for most B2B SaaS, but certainly enterprise B2B SaaS. And again, we won't go into this in detail, but if you go watch the last webinar we did about unit economics, you'll see that, your retention rate has really got to be commensurate to what the cost of acquiring that customer is. The more you pay to acquire the customer, the bigger your gross retention rate better be, because you'll never pay yourself back for those acquisition costs if not. Okay. So that's a little bit about the benchmark. I know this is a tough year. It's hard to get above that 90% number this year, but keep that in mind. It's like the minimum place where you want to try to be, especially if you're in B2B, mid-market or enterprise SaaS. We got any questions, Jeff? Or should we roll forward? Okay, cool. All right, so let's talk about net revenue retention. Now, the first thing you'll notice here is that we've got the same things circled plus a few more. Net retention takes into account all the negatives, all the downsells and cancellations, but it also takes into account any of the expansion that we had. Now, this is where I get to jump on my soapbox about why NRR is such a difficult metric to measure our teams by, because there's a lot of puts and takes in that number. Okay. You can see it's called a compound metric because there's so many different things piled into it. And so for you as a leader, if you're being incentivized on net revenue retention, then you really need to know how you're going to move that number. And I'll tell you this, moving the cancellations number is a lot different motion than moving the cross-sell number or the upsell number. Okay. Price increases is a much different play to run than minimizing downsells, and they may be related, right? But that's why when, I sometimes I say on LinkedIn that NRR is not a real customer success metric, and I get burned up, I get flamed whenever I say that. But this is why I don't like having a metric that rolls so many things together for you all and myself to be judged by, when there's really a lot more at play and we have to go figure out. So I would encourage you, even if that is your metric, don't go telling the board and your executive team that NRR is no good for customer success leaders or sales, but ask the next question. Okay, how are we going to go move that number? Is it in the retention? Is it in the downsells, or is it in the expansion? Also, very important, net revenue retention does not include new sales. Okay, that's very important. So any new sales, new ARR generated to existing customers, that's all going to be caught in these buckets. Okay, but net new logos, they don't go here. So that is net revenue retention. Okay, and you can see the calculations. I've included the calculations down here as well, just so you can see exactly how that's done. I would encourage you to always go talk to your finance team about how they're making these calculations, what goes in, what goes out, how they're breaking them down. You can do these types of calculations for different segments of your business. You might have an enterprise segment or an SMB, or you might sell to different industries. You might sell to manufacturing and retail and different industries that would all have different characteristics based on the way they adopt your technology and use your platforms. Okay. Robbie, I hope that answered your question. If not, please chime in. What we've seen happening in the publicly traded markets over the past really 18 months, 24 months since the interest rates started coming up, is that net retention has gone down precipitously. And we're going to dig into a case study of that in just a minute, which is a really interesting example of what you need to look for in these metrics to make sure you really understand what's happening behind the scenes. Okay, and it'll illustrate the net revenue retention problem.
We got one question. Before we jump to that question, one thing that I wanted to just highlight again, right? Going back to Robbie's point about kind of gross retention and where this fictitious company stands, right? No longer do we get to add all of the green boxes on top of that $10 million starting point, right? We actually have to move it down to that 86.5, $8,650,000 mark. And so just think, right? The more that you're able to improve that gross retention, that's your starting point to be able to kind of compound and grow on top of that. So just something like a visual thing for me that always just stands out, right? Wow, look, the upsell bookings really just canceled out our cancellations, and the cross-sell bookings didn't even really help us cancel out our downsells, right? So I just think about these things, and going back to your point, Jay, right? The reason I like this view a lot of times is you can start to see, okay, where do we have a problem that we need to go drive a project, a team, an initiative around, right? In this case, the cancellations represents the largest kind of bucket, right, in terms of what we're seeing. And so maybe that's where we got to go start. We have to go start with gross churn and figure out how we're going to go improve that. So just a point I wanted to call out. Jess says, how do you feel about NRR goals for product and engineering teams to ensure shared incentives?
This is a great question. This is such a good question. We'll probably do a whole topic on this with some leaders from those types of teams as well. In general, I think if people have a variable component, like a bonus component to their comp, then I think it can be a good idea. But what I would say is, depending on maybe at the executive level, yes, but as you go down into the teams, what I would say is that a product team probably needs to be aligned to which of the bars on here they're trying to help move in a given year. Are they trying to help with upsell? Are they creating new products that help us sell more? In general, I love the idea of getting our product teams more aligned with the outcome measures of the actual customer success metrics that we're looking at, like a North Star metric, and also with the business metrics. So Jess, the very broad answer to your question is yes. But I think there's probably some nuance in terms of how you would go execute that day to day.
Michelle has a pretty specific question, which I think we're not going to have the answer to right now, Michelle, but we do have a ton of, we've kind of put together a ton of resources around benchmarks and places that you can go look for this type of stuff. So we'll send that out as we send out this thing. But Michelle does ask, do you have any benchmarks for GRR, NRR for, in her case, something that's less than $1,000 ARR right now?
Yeah. So great question, Michelle. That is going to be, I gave you that 90% benchmark number. That's aspirational. If you're selling into SMB, I actually worked with a company a few years back that they were B2B, but they sold into like real estate agents and real estate brokerages. And if you know anything about that market, it behaves much more like a B2C kind of marketplace versus, selling to another company who's selling their products to a consumer. So, so the answer is yes. I mean, those retention rates can be as low as 75% up to 85%. But yeah, in general, if you're selling to SMB, you're going to have higher churn, but your cost of sale in theory should also be much lower. And so that gets back to the other dichotomy that I pointed out earlier. You can have a little bit higher churn as long as your cost of sale isn't the same as the cost of sale for that a company who's generating 95% gross revenue retention is having, if that makes sense.
Angela says, I'm in B2B with nearly all my customers being retailers. As retailers close stores as part of my routine operations, that lowers my retention on a per kind of store basis. So how do most SaaS businesses account for store closures as a part of that?
This is a great question. I actually used to be in a company and we sold on a unit basis as well. And so multi-location franchises where that would show up in this waterfall chart is as downsell. Okay. And you want to be very specific. That I would classify that as uncontrollable downsell. So once you start breaking this number out, the question is, or actually when you start breaking all the churn out, it's important to know what you can control and what you can't so that you can put your resources behind what you can control. And so if you just have this organic, natural shrinkage within your accounts because they're closing units, then you have to sort of deal with that and go, you just sort of take it for what it is and you go figure out where you can control churn. Do you have service issues? Do you have, quality issues that you need to address to help drive that up on the locations that you do have? One of the things I've also done to help mitigate that is have companies commit to a certain floor, if you will. Sorry about the little bubble there. I don't know where that came from, but have them commit to a certain floor of locations to make your revenue a little more predictable. Sometimes you can get away with that. Sometimes you can't. But it's worth it to maybe dig into that and see if there's an opportunity there.
All right. We got 3 more so far. AJ says, keep hearing about logo retention at my company. I assume that means the focus is on GRR for the moment. Is that correct?
This is a really good question, and we actually didn't even really address it here. So everything we're talking about is revenue retention. Okay, logo retention is if I have 1,000 customers at the beginning of the period, irrespective of what they pay us, how many of them do we lose versus how many of them do we keep? Okay, and if you, especially if you serve a long tail market, if you have, let's just say, thousands of customers that maybe pay you like I think it was who was it? The person who had the $1,000 year, it was Michelle. If you have a high volume of smaller accounts, then logo retention is going to be more important to you, especially if it's sort of uniform, right? Because logo retention is more of a it's more of a measure of client satisfaction than it is of, and it's a leading indicator to the business success, but it tells you, are your customers, do you have product market fit, and are customers happy with the solution that you're providing? Right. I would also tell you, like in that high volume situation, get a product like Turnkey. It doesn't have to be Turnkey, but get a product that helps you figure out why they cancel on the way out, so that you can reliably see that and understand whether or not, there's something you can do about it. So that was my shameless plug. What is the thrill of the shield, Jeff?
Yeah. Margaret says, is it important to separate upsell and cross-sell bookings, or is it acceptable to combine them?
Okay, so the key difference between an upsell and a cross-sell booking is that you're usually selling your same stakeholders more of something, right? They're going up onto a new plan that gives them more features. A cross-sell is a little bit different. I think of it as selling into a new department within an existing organization, or maybe even a new business unit within an existing organization. So a lot of times companies will count those separately because the cross sell feels more like a new sales kind of motion. It requires a lot more work. It might actually, like, I've been in companies where the account executives handled the cross selling of a new product into an existing company. So it carries all those new logo sales types of costs. So depending on how big those buckets are, if you're early stage, probably not a big deal. Like at Turnkey today, we don't differentiate those per se, but probably in a year's time, 2 years' time, we certainly will.
All right. Last one for right now is Brian. I've worked with ATR, which is available to renew. I think that it's interesting to look at your downsell and cancellation numbers compared to how much was available for renewal instead of ARR, especially if your renewals are much higher in one quarter compared to other quarters. Is this something that you've worked with?
Yes, and you were spot on, Brian. So renewal rate is a lot different metric than retention rate. All right. So let that sink in for a minute. I'm sure people are like, what? But renewal rate takes the exactly what you said, the amount that's eligible to be renewed in a given period, and then how much of that did we actually renew. So renewal rate is a separate metric. It's actually a leading indicator to gross retention rate and net retention rate. The other interesting thing about renewal rate is that if you have multi-year contracts with your customers, you're going to be renewing a much smaller percentage, potentially a much smaller percentage of customers than you actually have on the whole. So what that means is that your renewal rate can actually be lower, and you can still hit that target retention rate. I've been in companies where we shot for like an 85% gross renewal rate, while we still had a 90% gross retention rate. And that those two things, the math on that works because we're not renewing all the customers at once every year. We're only renewing them once every 2 years or every 3 years. So great call out. We should probably do some content on that at some point as well.
All right. We got a few more that came in. We have 10 minutes left. I'm going to hold these questions so we can just get through the rest maybe. And then we'll try and answer them at the end.
Okay, cool. Just give you one more quick, I'm going to give you one more quick benchmark here, and I'll just reference this and you all can go research it because there's a couple things we want to try to get to in the next 10 minutes here. But gross or net retention tends to fluctuate by a number of different things, the size and the stage of the company being one of them. So again, Benchmark, it's got some really cool benchmark analysis on this that you can go check out for free. You don't even have to, I don't think you even have to give them your email address to do that. So, all right. So I'm going to turn it over to Jeff, who's going to talk a little bit about a couple of case studies. Go for it, Jeff.
Yeah. So we actually wrote about this in our newsletter, shameless plug. You're most likely signed up for it. If not, I'm going to be asking you in a soon to be automated email to you. But we wrote about this morning. And so really cool example from David Spitz, just seeing these metrics kind of out in the wild. And so this one's a little bit harder. It's a little there's detective work that he did and some things. But the thing that I really wanted to underscore is what he found was Jamf, publicly traded company from 21 to 2023, they noticed net revenue retention went from 120% to 108. The net new ARR, so if you remember what from Jay's waterfall, right, kind of the everything that we've got for the year, was also reduced by about 25%. But we have sales and marketing and deferred commissions, the commissions that we're paying to sales reps, we see that up over 60%. And so what David is really underscoring by looking at some of these metrics and trying to kind of read between the lines here is that most likely they've got a gross churn problem, right? Like they're paying more. Most likely there's two scenarios. They're paying more to bring in new revenue. And that means that new revenue is still coming in, right? Because we can see deferred commissions has gone up. We can see the sales and marketing costs have gone up. So we are bringing in new business, but we're seeing that the net revenue retention goes down. So the most likely scenario is that, gross churn is up and their gross revenue retention is lower than what it has been in the past. And so just an example that was out in the wild, thought it was cool to highlight, and something that, when you start to look at these metrics and see them in different companies, right now you can start to figure out, okay, is their strategy changed? Are they doing something different? Are they noticing these things, right? Like you can start to see this in publicly traded companies, which I think is pretty cool. So this is just one example to highlight. And this one kind of specifically looks at gross revenue retention.
Yeah. And you can see just the brute force with which they're generating the same net new revenue every year. I mean, look at the difference in the cost in sales and marketing. It's insane how much this has gone up. So this is a great call out. All right, Jeff. Sorry.
All right. Next one, Salesforce. Salesforce is still one of the best performing SaaS companies, software companies that's out there. In 19, they were 13.28 billion. In 23, just a mere 5 years later, they're 31.35 billion. And this is their net revenue retention percentage. So, they in 19 it was 120. They went up 2 percentage points, which is 122. Another 2 percentage points, 124. And so there's two things that I find really interesting about this chart, which is the compounding nature of net revenue retention, right? Like they've clearly by roughly 2 percentage points of increase here is about $700 million that they're able to add on the top line just from their customers. They don't need to go sell anybody new. They literally can do that with what they've got, right? So really interesting. And also, right, the compounding nature over 5 years, they've gone from 13 to 31 because if you think about that waterfall chart, right, like they're starting the next year where that chart is, right, like where it ends, right? So 120 and 122, they're compounding on top of what they've got. Not only do they get to add new logo sales on top. And so I thought it was interesting to look at this. And then just as a quick example, on the next slide, what we did is just try to break down, okay, like what are some of the initiatives that they might be doing that would allow them to do that? So maybe they made an investment in customer success. And so, they know that higher satisfaction and reduced churn is going to help for NRR. So they implemented the Customer 360 platform, creating a unified experience. That's something that they did that they thought would move the NRR metric in a good direction for them. Next one, they acquired a number of companies. Tableau was one recently. And Jay just mentioned this, right? Like what a great ability for them to go cross-sell a different solution into their current customers. I own CRM. I need data visualization. Boom. That is, additive right there in terms of net revenue retention. Delivering the services that they're already delivering in a better way to current customers, right? So they are using Einstein AI. They're, delivering personalized journeys, but their hope is that they can improve gross retention or customer logo retention, and then also increase the lifetime value of a customer. And then lastly, the one that they threw out was offering incentives for customers to upgrade. So how can we increase that average revenue per user, reduce churn rates? And so again, these are potential initiatives, strategies that they're working on as business, and it's impacting what you're seeing in terms of the metrics and the revenue and the outcome of the business. And so just two examples we wanted to highlight as things that we saw as we were reading and and just for us, right, when you start to see these things more and more frequently, when you're asking questions, you can really start to figure out, okay, like which metric are they trying to move? I kind of go back to Jay's example, right? You've got kind of the 6 buckets of metrics that I can move. Which one am I really trying to move here, right? What are the strategies that we're tied to as a business? What are my OKRs? How do they ladder up? Those are the things that you can start to do when you start to understand this at a deeper level.
Yeah, and Jess made a great point. They bought Slack. That didn't hurt them at all. So awesome. So we've really blown through this. Appreciate everybody's questions. There's some really good questions asked, but handful of takeaways we want to leave you with here. Number one, ARR and MRR. It's not just ARR divided by 12 equals MRR and vice versa. There's some underlying fundamentals that are different, right? Those contracts and those upfront payments really define what annual recurring revenue is. Net new ARR growth, key indicator of company health. If you look at the last example, and if Salesforce is actually able to grow 25% just from net revenue retention, that means they're going to add another $9 billion on top of the $35 billion that they're going to do this year. So that can be a very powerful tool. Much harder to go out and find $9 billion of new business. And then, maybe the biggest takeaway from this is that NRR is awesome, but don't neglect GRR. You really have to peel that thing apart, understand what it is you're trying to move underneath there. I love this Einstein quote, compound interest is the 8th wonder of the world. It actually is. I'm trying to teach my kids this now about saving. So hopefully they'll do a better job than I've done. But that's what we're doing here. We're building companies that are basically compound interest businesses. And at that, they're very high margin compound interest businesses that give us a lot of leverage. So we'll wrap it up there. I'm going to put a quick plug in for the Cover Your SaaS financial literacy course. If you're attending this webinar, feel free to scan this. You'll get a 10% off. I think it's 10% off, right, Jeff?
Yeah.
For the course, but it's a 2-hour course. It's broken up into 5 to 7 minute chunks of video. You download the whole thing directly. There's no login to deal with. You download the whole thing directly to your laptop, and you can learn this stuff at your leisure. So we had a really great time, fun time making it, learned a lot doing it. And this is something that we feel like, we're trying to evangelize and proselytize into the SaaS leadership space. Doesn't matter what department you're in. If you're more financially savvy and you understand how your work is making an impact on financial outcomes for the business and customers, you're going to be unstoppable as a leader. So appreciate everyone's time. Thank you for all the great questions, and we look forward to following up with more of these types of sessions throughout the year. So we'll talk to you all soon.
Awesome. Thanks, all.